Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Grajdek. I'm Dr. Martha Grajdek. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Sometimes decision-making and the execution that should follow after the decision has been made can be slow or inefficient, but that's not because of a lack of talent or lack of resources. Instead, all too often, this is because of the ambiguity of decision-making roles. In organizations where potentially everyone is in charge of everything or no one is in charge of anything, decision-making and execution can prove to be a slow, inefficient process. Things like role clarity and decision rights are often at the center of the problem. Sometimes it may be difficult to recognize that the decision and execution processes are slow and inefficient simply because they have been in place for a while and maybe things have been deteriorating slowly over time. It may take a newcomer, a new addition to the team, to realize that these processes need to be revised. The first thing we need to look at is to identify that there is a problem and then seek out the source. Identifying the problem is often done by recognizing related symptoms. What are some symptoms of murky decision-making ownership? It could be things such as decision reversals. Decisions are made and reversed, potentially multiple times before a final decision is made. Sometimes decisions simply cannot seem to be made or finalized. Other times there seems to be a storm of CCs, meaning carbon copies, on emails and other communications. In an attempt to include everyone and cover all the bases, a decision is never made or made very slowly and inefficiently. When decisions are slow to be made, execution is also slow, which in turn affects progress. The good news is that there are some proven systems that any organization can bring into its fold and implement in the decision-making process. I'll review a couple of the more common decision-making protocols. Let's start with the RACI protocol, the RACI protocol. RACI stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. I'll get to the details of those in just a moment. To start with, this is a protocol that helps organizations to create an action plan for specific tasks. It focuses on small decisions throughout the organization. As we dive into the acronym, let's start with the first word, responsible. Very simply, identify who is responsible for completing a task or a set of tasks. As far as accountability goes, decide who is ultimately accountable for the outcome. When it comes to the consulting part, we need a list of those individuals who need to be consulted for feedback and any input that they might have. The last part pertains to information. Who needs to be informed about the progress of this particular decision-making event and the final decision as well? Think about where in your organization this approach might be helpful when it comes to decision-making, especially if the current process is not as organized and efficient as it could be. The next decision-making protocol for many organizations is the rapid protocol. This protocol helps organizations to determine their decision-making structure. This is big picture thinking and organization-wide design. A main advantage of using the rapid decision-making framework or protocol within an organization is that it ensures that all decisions receive careful consideration. RAPID is another acronym, of course, and it stands for responsible, approve, provide input, informed, and decide. First, we assign a person responsible for making the decision. Next, we identify who has the authority to approve the decision. Next, we list those who provide necessary input for the decision. We specify who needs to be informed about the decision and decision-making progress. And lastly, we clarify who makes the final decision, who gives that stamp of approval. Once again, this approach is relevant to the big picture, organization-wide decisions. The last protocol is the DRI protocol. That stands for Direct Responsible Individual. This could potentially be one of the simplest protocols, where one person is responsible for all of the decision-making parts. That means they gather any information that they require to make the decision. That includes any input and feedback from others, and arrive at the decision based on their findings. Using the DRI approach can be very flexible in that it can be used for decisions on an individual employee level, decisions pertaining to their daily activities and their daily tasks. Equally, this kind of approach could be used at the very top of an organization by someone such as a CEO or a president. These are just 3 examples of decision-making protocols, but there are many more that are available and have been shown to be effective and helpful. I encourage you to search out for more of the most common and helpful protocols that are currently being used by organizations worldwide. Once a protocol, or perhaps a number of different protocols, have been identified and defined within the organization, meaning how and when is it appropriate to use each protocol, it's important to make sure that keeping record, keeping track, is part of each of those decision-making frameworks. Things such as decision logs or escalation ladders or service catalogs, meaning who owns what at what service level, can be critical in terms of keeping track and making changes as appropriate. Keeping track not only offers an opportunity to get organized and to stay organized, but also to see progress and, as I mentioned, to make revisions or changes as necessary. Keeping track allows us to identify patterns. Sometimes those patterns can be ones that we want more of, so we can have the opportunity then to refine them and reproduce them. Other patterns may be ones that we should avoid within an organization. Regardless of the kind of patterns that you may discover by keeping records, only by identifying these patterns can you make the appropriate changes. Another important consideration when it comes to decision-making protocols or decision-making frameworks, especially as they are brought into the organization and introduced as new ways of doing things, it's important to make them visible to all of those within the organization who will be touched by or affected by these decisions. And while certain employees at certain levels or perhaps in certain departments will need to be aware of more details than other employees might. It's generally a good idea for employees as a whole, for the workforce as a whole, to understand any protocol changes so that confusion and speculation are avoided in the future. A good way to start, as I mentioned at the beginning, is to identify what the current decision-making process or framework is, or are if you have multiples within your organization. Identify what's working and what needs a revision. Consider applying one of the protocols that I introduced in this episode, or perhaps something else that you've identified on your own. Put it into place and monitor its progress. Review after 30 or 60 days, whatever is appropriate for your organization and decision-making processes. And then, of course, revise as necessary. The big takeaway is that if your current decision-making framework is slowing you down, it's time for something new. In order to find the best protocol, you may have to involve in some trial and error, certainly trial and revision. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. It is not uncommon that organizations find themselves struggling to make decisions quickly and efficiently. Execution based on those decisions can slow down as a result, and that can affect progress. Failing decision-making experiences may be rooted in lacking decision-making protocols or frameworks. The 3 common decision-making protocols that I recommend are the RACI protocol, the RAPID protocol, and the DRI protocol. Make sure to keep records and promote clear communications. And as always, when changes are implemented, let your employees know to avoid confusion or speculation. If you choose to bring on board a new decision-making protocol, be ready to review it within 30 or 60 days. Revise as appropriate so that you end up with the kind of decision-making framework that benefits the organization. As this week unfolds, I encourage you to consider decision-making within your organization. This is equally as important for those in management and leadership positions as it is for those who are not in management or leadership positions. After all, chances are that every individual at the organization makes some kind of decision on a daily basis. Now is a good time to consider whether these decisions or the protocols for the decision making is efficient or if it needs to be addressed. Is it something that's official, or is it something that you as an individual employee, for example, made up on your own and nobody else really knows about it? Is there an actual framework, or are you simply doing your best but not necessarily doing the same thing every time? And while traditionally those at the top are essentially responsible for the organization and its success, in reality, everyone has the opportunity to contribute and take responsibility. For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I encourage you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G, where you can find the video version of the podcast. Once there, check out some of the other videos which focus on stress management. As I said, Stress Free with Dr. G is available on YouTube, and the link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.